The phone was already quiet when I woke up. Not the ordinary quiet of a Thursday morning in January. Not the hush of the house settling. Not the radiator doing its clicking thing in the hallway. Not the sound of nothing in particular. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that has a shape. I lay there in the dark with the blanket pulled up to my chin, and I knew, the way you know when something in the house has shifted in the night, that something had been taken. I reached for my phone, 5:47 in the morning. No messages. That was not unusual by itself. Nobody texts their 74-year-old aunt at 5:47 in the morning. But I am a woman who has kept records for 52 years. I know the difference between nothing and the absence of something. There is a specific texture to genuine quiet. The quiet of a house in January before anyone has turned on a light. And there is a different texture to the quiet that follows a subtraction. The second kind is slightly louder. It has an edge to it, like the air after a door closes that you did not see close. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I put my feet on the cold floor. I went to make coffee. The canister on the counter, the white one, with the blue rooster painted on the side, the one my daughter Marguerite brought me from a farmer's market in Nachitoches 17 years ago, was almost empty. I made note of it. I measured what was left, spooned it carefully, filled the carafe from the tap, pressed the button, and stood in the kitchen while the machine worked. The smell came up slow and dark and familiar. That is the thing about coffee. It smells like intention, like a day that is about to start, whether you are ready for it or not. The machine hissed. The carafe filled. I stood in my nightgown in the cold kitchen and I waited, the way I have learned to wait, which is without impatience, which is one of the very few useful things that grief teaches you in its own time and which cannot be rushed. My name is Delphine Roux. I am 74 years old. I was born in a house 4 miles from where I now live, in a parish where my family has been burying its dead since 1887. I taught school for 31 years, first grade for 12 of them, then fourth grade for the rest, and I still occasionally have the dream where I am trying to get a classroom of 9-year-olds to settle down, and they simply will not, and I wake up from it slightly annoyed and then very relieved. I raised 2 daughters, both of whom turned out better than I deserved. I nursed my husband Armand through 4 years of illness, the kind of illness that moves in stages and has good months, and then takes those good months back without warning. And I sat beside him when he went, in the spring of 2019, in the yellow chair they had moved to his bedside from the corner of the room, holding his left hand in both of mine, because his right hand had stopped working 2 weeks before, and he was particular about comfort. After he died, after the year of paperwork and the quieter year after that, when I simply learned to be in the house without him, I became the person in this family who keeps the papers. That is not a small thing. I want you to understand that from the beginning. I found out what had happened at 7:23 that morning. I know the exact time because I had just sat down with my second cup and opened my phone to check the weather, and the app was already open on the family group chat, or what used to be the family group chat. The one called, with the cheerfulness people apply to things that do not deserve it, Roux family. I had been removed overnight. There was no message, no explanation, just a small gray line of system text where my membership used to be. It said, "You are no longer a participant in this group." I read it twice. I set the phone down. I picked up my coffee. It had gone tepid. I drank it anyway. Now, let me take you back 6 weeks, because the morning I was removed was not where the story started. It started at Thanksgiving. It started the way most things start in a family that has been a family long enough, not with a fight, not with a declaration, but with a small thing that nobody thought mattered. A comment, a remark, at a table, the kind of thing that lands in a room and nobody picks up, and it sits there on the floor, and eventually somebody steps on it, and the sound that makes is the sound of a relationship revising itself. The table was set for 19. My niece Sloane had taken over Thanksgiving 3 years earlier, when her mother, my sister, Cecile, passed. I want you to understand Cecile for a moment, because she matters to this story, even though she is gone from it. Cecile was 2 years younger than me, and where I am the kind of woman who keeps a household log, Cecile was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday and called on it without being reminded, and always knew which grandchild was having a hard time in school and what the hard time was about. She was the warmth of the family. I was the structure. We understood each other perfectly, the way sisters sometimes do after a lifetime of figuring out who each of them is. And she died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in October, without warning, while she was watering her tomatoes, and I went to her house that afternoon and sat in her kitchen and thought about all the things that disappear with a person that you had never thought to write down. Sloane is Cecile's daughter. She is 41, which means she was born when I was already in my 30s and already knew what I was. She is not a bad woman. I want you to hold that alongside everything I am about to tell you. She's not a bad woman. She just grew up in a family that confused efficiency with love, and she absorbed it so completely she cannot see where one ends and the other begins. She has her father's eyes, pale gray, the kind that look like they are doing arithmetic even when they are laughing. And she keeps her hair cut close on the sides, the way young women do now, which I noticed when I arrived at Thanksgiving, and which I thought suited her. She had worked hard on the dinner. I noticed that too. The turkey was good. The yam dish with the brown sugar crust was very good. Somebody had brought a cranberry thing in a mold that nobody ate, but which was respectfully passed around twice. The dinner rolls were store-bought, which I will not hold against anyone. And there was a green bean casserole that Beau's wife Tamara made that I would have asked for the recipe on any other day. We were at the long table in the dining room, the white oak table that my brother-in-law Gerard built the spring of 2004, the summer before his knees gave out, finished it himself with Danish oil and a sanding block he borrowed from his neighbor and returned 3 weeks later, and which Sloane had inherited along with the house. And there were 17 people around it and 2 children at the card table by the window who were eating with great enthusiasm and very little ceremony, which is how children should eat. I was seated at the far end, not the head, the far end. This is not a complaint. I am noting a fact. I am a woman who notes facts. I am noting it because placement at a table in a family that has been a family as long as this one is a form of language. It communicates. You may not intend it to communicate, but it does. The way the temperature of a room communicates, whether you are welcome in it even before anyone has said a word. The far end was the end farthest from where the conversation gathered. I could hear it, but I could not easily participate in it. The 2 cousins closest to me, young women in their 20s whose names I knew but whose daily lives I had lost track of, were engaged with their phones between bites, which is a habit I understand and do not begrudge, but which meant that for most of the meal I ate in a kind of companionable isolation. I ate my turkey. I ate the yam dish. I passed the cranberry mold. I listened. The conversation turned, as it does in November in Louisiana, to matters of property. Sloane's cousin Beau, he is 38, stocky in the way his father Gerard was before the knees and the hips, and then the heart, all took their turns, with a habit of putting his elbows on the table and leaning in when he talks, as if proximity is the same as persuasion, had been looking at land. He was talking about investment, expansion. The phrase family legacy came up 3 times in 4 minutes, which I always find is a sign that the person using it has not thought carefully about what the word legacy actually requires. Legacy is not a concept. It is a document. It is a record. It is the specific gravity of a specific thing, passed from one specific person to another, with witnesses and notarization, on a date that can be looked up. We should talk about the Perrin Road property, Beau said. He was not talking to me. He was talking at the table in general, which is a different thing. I said quietly, the Perrin Road property has a covenant that limits development to residential structures under 3,000 square feet. There was a pause, not a long one, the kind that passes for normal at a dinner table, the kind that follows a statement that has temporarily interrupted the current of the conversation. Aunt Delphine, Sloane said, and her voice had a particular note in it. Patient, modulated, the tone you use with someone who has wandered slightly off topic. We're just spitballing. I understand, I said. I'm just noting the covenant. Oh, right, she said, and she turned back to Beau. That was all. That is all it was. An interruption and a gentle redirect, and then the conversation flowing on, and me at the far end of the table eating my pie, the sweet potato which Sloane had made from scratch, and which was genuinely excellent. and saying nothing further for the rest of the meal. I hugged the grandchildren on the way out, the small ones who are still at the age where hugging a grandmother is uncomplicated and good, and I drove home in the dark on roads I have been driving for 40 years, and I did not think about it again that night. But something had happened at that table. I have been a school teacher long enough to know when a room decides a person is the problem. It is not a sound you hear. It is a frequency. It is the way a conversation adjusts its route around you, the way water goes around a stone. It is the slight recalibration in the way people make eye contact. They continue to include you, but they no longer assume you will want to be included in the thing that comes next. You are now the person whose presence requires management, the person who will say the inconvenient thing, the person who needs to be, in the language Sloane's generation has adopted for every uncomfortable truth, managed. I had taught school for 31 years. I had helped to bury more family members than I could count on both hands. I'd kept the records for this family through 3 decades of births and deaths and marriages, and the occasional disaster that families do not discuss publicly. I had, among other things I will come to, been the quiet infrastructure of a thing that called itself a family, and mostly was. And I had, apparently, in the course of an otherwise unremarkable Thanksgiving, become the designated bearer of inconvenient facts. I did not realize how far that had gone until the December meeting. The December meeting was not an official thing. Sloane had started it 3 years ago. For Sunday of December, her house, coffee, and pastries. Talk about the year and whatever practical matters needed addressing. It was a good idea. I had told her it was a good idea. I had told her so sincerely, because Cecile had tried to do something similar for years without quite getting it organized, and Sloane had managed it cleanly from the first. She had her father's organizational capacity and her mother's sense of what a family needs to feel like a family, even when those two things pulled in different directions. The gathering had grown. That first year there were 8 of us. By this past December there were 14, plus children who were deposited in the back room with a television and a reasonable quantity of Christmas cookies, and from whom occasional eruptions of volume were the only evidence they were there. I arrived at 10:15. The pastries were already mostly gone. The good ones, the ones from the Desjardins Bakery on Rue Burgundy, that Sloane always ordered special because she knew they were the ones people remembered, the ones with the almond paste and the laminated edges. But there was coffee, and I found a chair near the window, and I helped myself to a plain croissant, and I listened. The conversation covered the usual December things: a grandchild's school performance, a cousin's new apartment, the prospect of a family trip that had been discussed in various forms for 3 years and showed no signs of becoming concrete. Outside Sloane's window, I could see the corner of the yard where Cecile used to have her tomatoes, which Sloane had replanted with herbs, and a rose bush that was, in December, bare-caned and slightly melancholy. I watched it while I listened to the conversation circle around itself the way December conversations do, warm and slightly aimless, and I thought about Cecile, as I still do most days, without grief exactly. The grief had done its work, but with the particular awareness of her absence that is just the permanent shape of things now. Then they turned to the Fontenot funeral. Old Marcel Fontenot, who had been the unofficial historian of the parish for 40 years, and who had known my father, and who had attended every major family event in the Roux family, with the reliable presence of a man who considered himself an honorary member of everything, had died in November. He had been 91. It was not a tragedy. It was an ending, and the distinction matters. His family had buried him in the wrong section of the cemetery. This is a specific kind of error that people who have not dealt with family burial plots do not fully understand, but I will try to explain it. In the older parishes of this part of Louisiana, the family sections of the cemetery are not suggestions. They were established with covenants, with deed language, with the very specific intention of families staying together in the way that families in this culture believed it mattered to stay together. You were buried near your people. That was not sentiment. It was architecture. It was a decision made by grandparents before you were born that you were then the caretaker of, the way you are the caretaker of any inherited thing. And when a funeral home places a body without consulting the covenant map, as happened with Marcel Fontenot, who was put in the eastern section when the Fontenot deeds specified the northern section. The correction that follows is not a simple matter of paperwork. It is a matter of lawyers, and of a family having to revisit a grief they thought they had finished, and of a process that can take months and cost money and cause the kind of harm that quiet administrative negligence causes when the person it harms is already in the ground. I mention this, not as a horror story, as a fact. The Fontenots had to do an emergency plot transfer, I said, because the funeral home placed Marcel without checking the covenant map. It took 3 months and 2 lawyers and cost the family considerably more than the original arrangements. Sloane, who was refilling her coffee cup at the kitchen counter with her back to me, said, It's worth knowing, I said. For when it matters. These things have a way of mattering at exactly the moment when no one has the bandwidth to deal with them. We'll deal with that when we deal with it, Beau said. He said it pleasantly, not dismissively, or not intentionally dismissively, the way a person says something when they are thinking about other things. I know, I said. I'm just saying it's worth having the documentation in order, the family plots, the deed language. Someone should know where those things are. Sloane turned around. She had a look on her face that I recognized. It is a look that says, "We love you, but you are making this harder than it needs to be." It is a look that is not unkind exactly. It is a look that costs nothing in its giving and means nothing as currency, because it is not offered as real engagement. It is offered as management. It is the visual equivalent of saying, "I hear you," when you have not actually listened. "Aunt Delphine," she said, and she said it gently. "I want to give her that," she said it gently. "Every time we have one of these, you bring up things like this, the covenants, the documentation, the death stuff." "I mentioned practical matters," I said. "They are practical matters." "It's December, wait," Beau said. "It's almost Christmas. We're trying to have a nice morning." I looked at him. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, a mug with his daughter's handprints on it from some school art project, red and blue and slightly overlapping, and he was looking at me with the expression of a person who is being reasonable. I put my coffee cup down on the windowsill. The ceramic clicked against the painted wood. I said carefully, "I'm not trying to prevent a nice morning. I am trying to make sure someone in this family knows where the paperwork is. That is all I am doing." Nobody said anything to that. The conversation resumed, the way conversations do when someone has said something that everyone has agreed, without discussion, to let pass. I sat in my chair by the window, and I finished my plain croissant, and I looked at the bare-caned rose bush, and I thought about the thing I was holding and the fact that nobody in the room had thought to ask about it. I finished my coffee. I said my goodbyes. I hugged the children who ran out from the back room for the purpose, sticky with Christmas cookie sugar, and briefly, generously affectionate. I put on my coat, the good wool one, gray, that I have had for 12 years, and which still holds its shape because I have it cleaned every October without fail, and I drove home. That evening I sat at the secretary desk for a while, not working, just sitting. The desk was Armand's mother's, her writing desk, the one she used for correspondence. Dark wood that I have always thought was walnut, though I am not entirely certain, with brass pulls worn to a matte finish from decades of use. She died in 1998, and the desk came to us, and I use it now for bills and documents and the filing that a house generates in its ongoing life. Behind the second drawer, there is a lockbox. I did not open it that evening. I simply sat at the desk and thought about what had happened that morning and what it told me about where things stood. I have lived long enough to know that the way a family treats its inconvenient truths is the exact same way it will treat its inconvenient people. This is not a theory I developed in an academic setting. It is a thing I observed over 31 years in classrooms, and over 52 years as a woman in the world, and over 26 years as the keeper of documents that this family would eventually need, when a room decides that the mention of death is the same as the presence of death, when the person who keeps the records becomes, in the minds of the people around her, identified with what the records are about. That room has made an error in category, a significant one, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that arrives eventually in the form of a question about a document that everyone assumed was somewhere and no one thought to track down. 3 weeks later, the morning I was removed from the group chat, the category error had been completed. I had been reclassified from record keeper to burden, from institutional memory to negative presence, from the woman who knew where the papers were to the woman whose knowing was the problem. Now, let me pause here because there is something I have not told you yet, something I have been carrying since the first sentence of this story, behind the coffee canister with the blue rooster and the fig tree and the chair with the cold floor and all of it. Something that changes the geometry of everything you have heard so far. You have been watching a woman being made smaller, seated at the far end of the table, redirected at the December meeting, removed, eventually, with a line of gray system text from the place where her family had its daily life. And I imagine you have felt what this kind of story produces in an audience. A rising sense of wrong, a desire for reckoning, the question of what she's going to do about it. Here is what she already has. Behind the second drawer of the secretary desk in my front room, in the lockbox with the key that lives on the ring with my car key and my house key. A ring I have carried every day for 6 years. There are 11 documents. Each one is a cemetery plot deed. Each deed covers a specific number of plots in the Rue family section of St. Agnes Parish Cemetery, which was established in 1887 by my great-great-grandparents on Armand's side, and which has held Rue family members in the northern section. Ever since, Armand's parents are there. My own parents are there because my family and the Rue family have been intertwined in this parish for 4 generations. And when I married Armand, we were not crossing families so much as braiding 2 already tangled branches of the same tree. My sister Cecile is there, in the plot she and Gerard had chosen together 20 years before she needed it, because that is how people in this parish have always understood things, not as morbidity, but as order. And Armand is there, in the plot we chose together in the spring of 1997, on a Sunday afternoon when the azaleas were still out, and the light was long and gold. And we walked the section together, and I pointed at the shaded spot near the Dufresne family corner and said, "This one." And he said, "You always liked shade." And I said, "I'm thinking of the person who will visit." And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's you." And I said, "I know." And we stood there for a moment, with the sun on our backs and the smell of freshly cut grass and the sound of the groundskeeper's mower somewhere to the south. And then we went home and did not speak of it again for 20 years. Every living member of this family, Sloane, Beau, the 14 cousins, their spouses, their parents, the ones who come to Christmas and the ones who come to nothing, the ones who sent flowers when Armand died, and the ones who did not, has a designated plot in that cemetery. The plots were allocated by Armand's father, who was an organized man, with a clear sense of family obligation. In the 1970s and 1980s, as the family grew, the deeds were updated as families changed. They passed to Armand when his father died in 1991, and they passed to me when Armand asked me to take them in 2018, when he was still well enough to be organized about things and had decided he wanted the paperwork settled before it needed to be settled in a hurry. He called me into the front room on a Saturday afternoon and handed me the lockbox and the key. He said, "You're the one who knows where everything is. These should be with you." I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm fine. I'm being practical." He was, in fact, fine that day. He had 8 more months, but he was being practical, which was one of the things I loved most about him, and he was right. And I took the lockbox and added it to the drawer and put it into my household log and did not make a large thing of it. All 11 deeds, every plot in the Rue family section, held solely in my name. I am not telling you this because I am proud of it as leverage. I want to be precise about that. I did not sit at the far end of that Thanksgiving table with a secret weapon. I did not sit at the December meeting with a hand of cards I was planning to play. I sat there as the person I have always been, the record keeper, the institutional memory, the woman who knows where the papers are, and I was redirected and managed and eventually removed, and none of it changed the fact of what was in the drawer. The fact simply existed, as facts do, patient and untroubled. Waiting. The 3 weeks between the December meeting and the morning I was removed were instructive, the way quiet periods often are when you are paying attention. The first thing I noticed was the silence about New Year's. Every year since Armand died, I had hosted New Year's Eve. Small gathering, 12, 14 people, champagne at midnight, the playlist Marguerite made that lived on my phone and always started with Fats Domino and ended with something that made the younger ones dance in my kitchen on the old tile floor, which has a very specific sound under dancing feet that I have come to associate entirely with the last hour of December. I had not yet received any message about whether this was happening. I assumed I would hear from someone in the group chat. No message came. I checked the group on the 28th. Vigorous activity. Photographs from Christmas. A video of one of the grandchildren demonstrating a card trick with more confidence than accuracy. A long discussion about a new restaurant in the French Quarter. Several exchanges about which aunt made the better pralines that devolved pleasantly into a small family argument that resolved in nobody's favor. Warm, ongoing, alive. I had sent nothing in the chat since early December, and nothing had been directed to me, and the warmth had the texture of warmth that occurs in a room from which one person has been quietly removed and nobody has noticed yet, or nobody has chosen to notice. I sent a message on the 29th. Straightforward, no edge to it. I asked whether anyone was planning something for New Year's and whether I should set something up, or whether people had their own arrangements and I should plan a quiet evening at home. 3 people responded. Marguerite, from Baton Rouge, who was with her husband's family and wouldn't be in the parish anyway, and said so with warmth and a photograph of her kitchen in Baton Rouge decorated for the holiday. 2 cousins, who said they were traveling. That was all. On the 31st of December, I sat in the front room with a glass of champagne at midnight and watched the television, the program they do from New York, which I do not particularly enjoy but which provides company of a kind, and heard the fireworks going off in 3 directions from the neighborhood, and I was fine. I want to be clear about that because clarity matters. I was fine. I have been alone on harder nights than that one. There is a specific quality to the new year that widows know well, which is that the year changing no longer feels like a beginning in the way it used to, when Armand was alive and the year was something we were beginning together. Now the year changes, and I am still here, and I am still myself, and that is what is true, and that is enough. But I also noticed with the same calm attention I bring to the household log and the documents and the temperature of the coffee, that the shift had become structural. I was no longer the woman who hosted things. I had become, in the architecture of this family's life, optional. The infrastructure you do not notice until it fails. The first week of January confirmed it. There was a conversation in the group chat about Beau's land project, the Perrin Road property, the one with the covenant I had mentioned at Thanksgiving, and which had been received with the warmth one reserves for someone who has just pointed out that the soufflé isn't rising. The conversation had the energy of a thing already decided, the particular forward momentum of people who have cleared the room of friction and are now moving at the speed they prefer. There was talk of an investor, a cousin who had some connection to commercial development, a timeline that was ambitious and which I could have, in about 4 minutes with the right county records, explained, was inconsistent with the covenant language. I did not say that. I sent one message. I said, I want to mention again that Perrin Road has a residential covenant. The specific language limits structures to residential use under 3,000 square feet. I can send the documentation if it would be useful. Sloane wrote back within the hour. Thanks, Aunt Delphine. We have a lawyer looking at it. Beau wrote, appreciate it. 2 messages. Cordial, brief, terminal. The kind of response that closes a conversational door without making a sound. That was the last message I sent in the Roux family group chat. 4 days later, on a cold Thursday morning in January, over coffee that had gone cold while I was reading the paper, I opened my phone and saw the gray line of text that said, I was no longer a participant. I read it twice. I set the phone down. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. Now I want you to feel what I felt in that moment, because I am not going to label it for you. I have no interest in performing what I felt. I'm going to tell you what I did. I finished the coffee, cold as it was, because I was raised in a household where you did not waste things, and because the action of finishing it gave me a moment to think. I rinsed the cup at the sink. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the fig tree, the one Armand planted in 1991. He planted it for me because I had mentioned once that I had grown up with a fig tree in the yard and missed having one, and he remembered. which is the kind of remembering that is actually love. And the branches were bare in January, and the bark was dark and slightly wet from overnight rain. And I stood there for 3 minutes, not thinking, just looking, letting the thing settle into its actual shape. Then I dried my hands on the dish towel. The yellow one with the small embroidered border that my younger daughter Vivienne brought me from a trip to Portugal. A stall at a market in Lisbon. She had sent me a photograph of herself holding it up with the market behind her. And I have used it every day since, because that is what you do with the things people bring you back from far away. And I went to the secretary desk. I sat down. I opened the second drawer. I took out the lockbox. I used the key. I did not open the deeds. I didn't need to look at them. I knew what was in them, the way you know the contents of a room you have lived in for 30 years. By feel, by weight, by the particular smell of old paper that has been stored with care. I knew that Sloane had 3 plots allocated. One for herself, one for her husband Malcolm, one for a future she may or may not want. I knew Beau had 2, with his wife, and a plot reserved beside his father Gerard's, because Gerard had asked for that specifically in the letter he sent with his plot preferences, a letter I had filed in the accordion folder, behind the desk in 2006 when he first got his diagnosis and wanted to be practical about things. I knew every name, on every deed, the way you know a room by heart. I sat for a moment with the lockbox in front of me. Then I opened my phone and called Patricia Delacroix. Patricia has handled my legal affairs for 18 years. She is a practical woman of 62, who has the specific manner of a person who has seen every variety of human complication and been unsurprised by all of them, and who communicates in the efficient shorthand of someone whose time is valuable and who knows that yours is too. She answered on the second ring. "Patricia," I said, "I want to talk about the cemetery deeds." "All right," she said. She waited. "I want to make sure the transfer procedure is current. Who can initiate a transfer? What's required? What the timeline is for any modification." A brief pause. "You want confirmation that you're the only one who can authorize plot changes." "Yes, you are," she said. "As sole deed holder, no transfer, reassignment, or modification can be executed without your written authorization. That holds regardless of what the family wants or what the funeral home assumes. Not the church administration, not the cemetery management, not a family member. You." "Good," I said. "I want to add explicit language to each deed, a line noting that authorization is held solely by me, and that the deeds are not to be transferred without written instruction from me personally, or from my designated executor, in the event of my death." "That's already the implication of the deed structure," Patricia said, "but explicit language creates a cleaner paper trail. I can draft amendment language for all 11. "Please," I said. "And one more thing. My executor designation is still Armand's cousin Theo. He passed in November. I need to update that." "Who do you want?" "Marguerite," I said. "My daughter." "I'll have the drafts to you by Thursday," Patricia said. "Thank you," I said. I closed the phone. I sat in the front room for a moment with the morning light coming through the curtains. Thin winter light, pale and even, the kind that makes the room look like a photograph of itself, and I listened to the mockingbird in the yard. They stay through winter in Louisiana, the mockingbirds. They do not leave the way other birds leave, and in January, when everything else is quiet, they practice their whole repertoire alone, cycling through songs, auditioning phrases, which I have always thought was a kind of courage, the willingness to sing in an empty yard in January without an audience and without apology. I listened to it for a while. Then I got up and made a fresh pot of coffee. Let me tell you about the days that followed, because they were not the days you might expect. I did not spend those days planning. I did not construct a strategy. I did not rehearse what I was going to say or imagine the scene in which I said it. Those are the moves of someone who is reacting, and I had decided, quietly, the way I decide most things, that I was not going to react. I was going to do what I always do. I was going to keep the records accurately and wait for the records to be needed. I went to the grocery on Friday and bought, among other things, a new bag of coffee beans, because the canister with the blue rooster was empty. I found the same brand Armand and I had always used, a dark roast from a small company in New Orleans that I have ordered by mail for 20 years, and which still comes in the same brown paper bag with the same green ink, which is one of those small continuities that anchors a life in a way you do not notice until you imagine its absence. I put it in the canister. I noted it in the household log. Coffee restocked January 9th. On Saturday, I walked, which I do when the weather permits, which in January in Louisiana mostly permits. I walked the route I have walked for 12 years. Down Magnolia, past the Thoreau house with the blue shutters, left on persimmon, through the park where the live oaks make a canopy even in winter, their leaves the dusty gray green of live oak in January, which is different from any other green. I walked for 40 minutes and thought about Armand, who used to walk with me on this route on Sunday mornings, and I thought about Cecile, who used to call me on Saturday afternoon so reliably that I still find myself near the phone at 2 o'clock on Saturdays, waiting for a call that has not come in 3 years. I thought about the family that was meeting somewhere in a chat I was no longer in, passing videos and arguing about restaurants and planning Beau's land project with the forward energy of people who had cleared the room of friction. I thought about the 11 deeds. I was not angry. I want to be honest about this, because there is a version of this story where the woman is fueled by anger, where the restraint is the elegant disguise of something that is burning underneath it. And that would make for a cleaner story, but it would not be accurate. What I felt was closer to sorrow, not grief exactly, not the specific grief of loss, which I know well, and which has its own particular weight. This was a smaller thing. It was the sorrow of being correctly seen by a room and having the room turn away from what it saw. I had showed them, at Thanksgiving in December and every other gathering, exactly who I was. I was the person who kept the records. I was the person who mentioned the covenant and the Fontenot error and the importance of knowing where the documents were. I was the person who treated practical matters as practical matters, because they are. Because love without practicality is just sentiment, and sentiment without documentation is just air. They had seen that person clearly and decided she was too heavy for the lightness they wanted. I understood it. I did not like it. I understood it. Now, you have been waiting, I imagine, since the midpoint of this story to know when. When does she play the card? And I will tell you, it was not a dramatic decision. It was not a plan I executed. It was a question that arrived, as questions in families always do, from a direction nobody anticipated and under a pressure that had been building unacknowledged for longer than anyone had admitted. It was Sloane who called, not Beau. Sloane. The call came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of February, which means it was 6 weeks after the December meeting and 5 weeks after I had been removed from the chat. I was at the kitchen table with tea. I had switched to tea in the afternoons, which I had been meaning to do for years. The coffee in the evenings was affecting my sleep. And the newspaper, the actual physical newspaper, the one that comes in a plastic sleeve and leaves ink on your fingertips and which I have taken since 1974. My phone rang. Sloane's name appeared. I set the paper down. I let it ring twice. I answered. Aunt Delphine, she said, and her voice was different. Not the modulated managing voice, a quieter voice. A voice with something cautious in it that I recognized because I had heard it in classrooms for 31 years. The voice of someone who needs something and is not certain of their reception. Sloane, I said, do you have a minute? I do, I said. A pause, the particular pause of someone organizing their approach. Then, I wanted to check in about the cemetery plots. I said nothing. I held the phone and I let the silence do what silence does when you do not fill it. Beau was asking, she said. His dad, Uncle Gerard, has been having some health things. Nothing acute, he says. But it seemed like it would be good to have everything organized, you know, just to have it in order. Of course, I said. Do you happen to know where those documents are, the plot deeds? I looked out the kitchen window, the fig tree, still bare in February, but I knew, from 30 years of watching it, that the buds were probably there if I went and looked closely. Not visible yet, but there. Yes, I said. I know exactly where they are. Oh, good. The relief in her voice was so plain it was almost audible as a physical thing. A breath let out, a tension released, the sound of someone who had been afraid the answer would be different. Do you think you could maybe send copies to a shared folder? Or we could set something up, some kind of central place where people could... I think, I said, we should talk in person. A pause, longer than the earlier one. Sure, she said. Absolutely, when works for you. Sunday, I said. Come to the house. I'll make lunch. She said she would be there. She said it with the gratitude of someone who had expected more friction and had not found it, and that was fine. I did not want friction. I wanted, as I had always wanted, for this family to know where the papers were. She came on Sunday with Beau, which I had expected. She also brought her husband Malcolm, the quiet man with a small silver scar on his chin from an old accident involving a boat and a dock railing, which he mentioned once and never again, and which I have always thought of as a detail that is entirely consistent with who he is, and that I had not expected, but I was glad for it. Malcolm has always been decent to me. He is the kind of person who listens when someone is talking, actually listens, not while formulating his response, and in a family that largely communicates by managing each other, that quality stands out. I had made a chicken stew, the kind with pearl onions and thyme, and a long simmer, the kind that requires patience and produces a smell that fills the house from early in the morning. The bread was from the Desjardins bakery on Rue Burgundy, because if I was going to have this conversation, I was going to have it with good bread on the table. I had set the table, my kitchen table, the one from the estate sale in 1987, the one with the slight groove on the left side from the time Marguerite was 6 and pressed too hard with a pencil doing her homework, with the good dishes, not the fancy dishes, but the everyday good ones, the blue and white ones that Armand and I bought at a pottery market in Covington the second year we were married, which I use when I want a meal to feel like it matters. We ate first. This was non-negotiable. I was not going to discuss documents over empty plates. The stew was good. I had put the thyme from the pot on the back porch, the French thyme, the kind that smells like something specific to a summer you cannot quite place. And the bread was excellent, and we talked about ordinary things while we ate. Malcolm asked about the fig tree. I told him the variety. It is a brown turkey, which is not a name that does justice to the fruit, which is dark and sweet, and opens like a small purple jewel when it is exactly right. And when Armand had planted it, and that it had produced so heavily last summer, I had given bags of figs to 4 neighbors, and still had more than I could manage. He said that was something. I said it was. Sloane asked about Marguerite. I said she was well, which was true. Marguerite had called on Tuesday, and we had talked for 45 minutes about her garden, and her husband's new job, and the book she was reading, and the fig tree, as we always talk about the fig tree because I mention it most calls, and she has developed, over the years, a fondness for it by proxy. Beau talked about his daughter, the one who was doing well in school, and had recently decided she wanted to be a veterinarian, which I thought was excellent. He told a story about driving her to a 4-H fair in November and getting lost on a back road and discovering a roadside stand that sold nothing but sweet potato pie, which they ate in the car before anyone knew they were supposed to have one. He told it well. He told it with the warmth of a man who loves his daughter and knows how to convey that in a story. I watched him and I thought about what I said earlier, about Sloane not being a bad woman, and I want to extend that here. Beau is not a bad man. He is a man in his late 30s who grew up in the cultural assumption that practical matters are handled by the people who handle practical matters, and that the people who handle practical matters are not the interesting ones at the table, and he absorbed that assumption so completely he could not identify it as an assumption at all. It was just the way things were. That is different from cruelty. It is something, but it is not cruelty. After lunch, when the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured and the bread basket was down to crumbs, Sloane folded her hands on the table and looked at me. "So," she said, "the plots." "Yes," I said. I went to the front room and came back with the lockbox. I set it on the table between us, on the table with the groove from Marguerite's pencil, on the table where I have had 1,000 quiet meals alone since Armand died, on the table where the good blue and white dishes were still in front of us with the rings from the coffee cups. I used the key. I took out the 11 deeds and laid them on the table in a row, not fanned out like a display. In a row, in order, the way you lay documents out when the documents are the point. Sloane looked at them. Beau leaned forward. Malcolm looked at them, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has understood what he is looking at. "These are the deeds," I said, "for the Rue family plots at St. Agnes Parish Cemetery, all 11. I have held them since 2019, when Armand asked me to take over the family records. They are in my name." Sloane reached for the nearest one. I did not stop her. She picked it up and read it. Her face did the thing a face does when it encounters a fact it had genuinely not accounted for. Not shock. She is too composed for shock. Recalculation. The pale gray eyes doing their arithmetic in the way they do when the equation has changed. "Your name," she said. "My name," I said. "All of them." "All of them," I said. "Each deed covers specific plots in the Rue section. Yours are on the 3rd deed, Sloane. 2 plots for you and Malcolm. 1 additional. Beau's are on the 6th deed. You and your wife Tamara, and a plot beside your father's, which is what Gerard asked for." Beau had been leaning back in his chair in the posture of a man at a table he thought he understood. He leaned forward now with a different quality of attention. "So," he said, "we need your authorization for anything to do with the plots." "Written authorization." "Yes," I said. "As sole deed holder, no transfer, reassignment, or modification can happen without my signature. I had the language clarified last month with my attorney. There are amended documents on file now if you'd like to review them." Silence. The refrigerator hummed its uneven hum. The compressor. I've been meaning to have someone look at it. I heard it clearly in that moment, in the way you hear ordinary things when a room has gone very quiet. Sloane set the deed down on the table. She looked at the row of 11. Then she looked at me. "Aunt Delphine," she started, and then she stopped. She picked up her coffee cup. She set it down without drinking from it. She looked at the deeds again, the row of them, each one representing a name, several of the names people who were still alive and sitting at various tables in this parish without ever having thought about this piece of paper and what it held. "I'm not telling you this to cause a problem," I said. My voice was the same as it was when I called Patricia. The same as it was on Thanksgiving. The same as it always is, because it has always been the same. I am telling you because you called me and asked where the paperwork was, and now you know. That is what I do. That is what I have always done. "We removed you from the chat," Beau said. He said it plainly. Not apologetically, not defensively. Plainly. "You did," I said. He looked at the table. He had the mug with his daughter's handprints somewhere at home. He was holding a plain white mug today. He set it down. "We didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it. That was not a rhetorical concession. It was the plain truth, and I wanted it to land as such. They had not known. They had been managing what they saw, which was an older woman who brought up death at the wrong moments, and they had not thought to ask what the death-related documents were, or where they were kept, or who held them. That is a failure of a specific kind. The failure of a family to ask its record keeper what the records say. But it is not malice. It is, like most family failures, a failure of imagination dressed up as consideration. Malcolm spoke. He had been quiet through all of it, and when he spoke it was the specific quality of quiet he always brought to his words, careful even, not without feeling but not overwhelmed by it either. "What happens when—" he started, and then reframed it. "If something happened to you, who would have access?" "My daughter Marguerite is my designated executor," I said. "She knows where the deeds are. She has a copy of the amended language. She is aware of every allocation. If something happens to me, you would contact Marguerite." Marguerite, who had said, when I called to tell her what I was doing, not the removal from the chat. I had not told her about that. Just the deed amendments and the executor change, had said only, "Good, Maman, that's the right thing." And then she had asked about the fig tree. "And in the meantime," Sloane said, her voice had changed registers again. All the management had gone out of it. She was speaking without the modulation now, without the careful, patient note. She sounded like herself, or like the self I remembered from when she was younger, when she was Cecile's daughter at the Sunday table, before she had picked up the machinery of running things and mistaken it for the thing itself. "What do you need from us?" I looked at her across the table, across the 11 deeds laid out in a row, across the good blue and white coffee cups. I don't need anything, I said. I have what I need. I'm telling you about the deeds because it is the practical and right thing to do, and because this family will need these papers. And when they need them, they will need them quickly, and the time to know where they are is not then. It is now. Something moved across Sloane's face. Not shame, exactly. I have seen shame in 31 years of classrooms, and I know its shape. This was more like the expression that appears when a person has been carrying an assumption for so long it had become invisible, and the assumption has just been made visible again, and the person is seeing it for the first time from the outside. She was seeing the category error, the reclassification, the record keeper who had become the problem. About the group chat, she said. Sloane, I said. Quietly, not unkindly, not with any edge. It doesn't matter. It does, she said, and she said it the way her mother would have said it, with the particular insistence of someone who believes that named things heal better than unnamed ones, which I think is true, and which is a gift that Cecile passed directly to her. What matters, I said, is that you know where these are, and that we understand each other. We sat there for a moment, the four of us, at the kitchen table, with the coffee in the cups, and the fig tree outside and the refrigerator doing its uneven hum, and the 11 deeds laid out between us like a hand of cards that had been in a pocket the whole time, and had never needed to be played because the game had always been won. Then Malcolm said the chicken stew was excellent, and asked if I used fresh thyme or dried, and I said fresh from the pot on the back porch, and he said that was the difference, and Bo said his wife had been trying to get a thyme plant going for a year and could never keep it alive, and I said the secret was drainage. And we talked about drainage for a few minutes, and the room finished being what it had been and became something else. I put the deeds back in the lockbox, one at a time. I used the key. Before they left, Sloane stood in the doorway of the front room for a moment. She had been in this house more times than she could count. I wondered if she had noticed the secretary desk before. It is not a large piece of furniture. It does not announce itself. It sits against the wall between the window and the bookshelf, in a house that has had it so long it reads as part of the structure, as unremarkable as the baseboards or the light switch. Is that where you keep them? She said. Not quite a question. Second drawer, I said. She looked at it for another moment. The brass pulls, the fold-down surface, the ordinary fact of it. Then she crossed the room and she hugged me. Not the managed hug. Not the kiss on the cheek that means I am performed the family affection and may now move on. A real hug, the kind her mother used to give, the kind that has some actual weight in it. I held her for a moment. I smelled her perfume, something clean and modern that I did not recognize, and underneath it, something that was just her, which was something I recognized from when she was a child standing in this same room with her mother. And I held that recognition carefully, the way you hold things that are both present and gone. She pulled back. She looked at me. I'm going to add you back to the chat, she said. All right, I said. Today, she said. All right, I said. She left. I stood in the doorway and watched them drive away in Sloane's car. A white sedan, clean as everything Sloane keeps, that turned at the corner and disappeared. The afternoon light was doing what January light in Louisiana does when it comes in low, that specific angle that makes the world look both older and more deliberate, like everything is sitting for a portrait of itself. I went inside. I washed the lunch dishes, the good blue and white ones, each one held carefully under the warm water, the plates and the cups and the stew bowls and the bread basket, and I dried them and put them back in the cabinet. I covered the leftover stew in a container for the refrigerator. I wiped down the table, felt the groove under the cloth, felt it the way I feel it every time, with the specific knowledge that a groove made by a 6-year-old's pencil has now been in this table for 41 years and will be in it after I am gone, and will not explain itself to anyone who touches it then. I went to the secretary desk. I sat down. I took the lockbox from the second drawer. I unlocked it and took out the deeds, and I sat with them in the thin afternoon light, and I went through each one. Not reading them in full, I knew what they said. I was visiting them. The way you visit things that you hold in trust. Sloane's 3 plots, Beau's 2, with the note about Gerard's preference, the 14 cousins between them, each one with a specific square of ground in the northern section of St. Agnes that had been waiting, patiently and without drama, since before some of them were born. I took out my pen. I noted the date in the margin of each deed, February this year. With a line, reviewed in meeting, authorization confirmed, documentation updated per P. Delacroix amendments. Just a notation, just a fact. The kind of fact that does not ask anything of anyone. It simply exists, accurate and dated, in the way that matters when the moment arrives. I put the deeds back. I locked the box. I noted it in the household log. February meeting with Sloan, Beau, Malcolm. Deeds reviewed and confirmed. Location communicated. I wrote the date and the time in my careful hand, and I put the log back on the shelf. 2 days later, the notification appeared on my phone. Sloan Thibodeau has added you to Rue family. And then the chat was there again. The same sunflower emoji, the same name, the same ongoing conversation. I read back through what I had missed. A video of a grandchild attempting and failing a backflip in the backyard, which made me smile. A discussion about Easter already. Someone asking about a restaurant. Ordinary family. I typed, good to be back. 4 people responded. Warm things. The kind of warmth that is genuine, even when it is also slightly relieved. The warmth of a room that has admitted it, made an error without necessarily having the vocabulary to name the error, which is better than the alternative, which is the room that does not admit it at all. I put my phone on the counter and poured a fresh cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, with it steaming in my hands. The fig tree. The first leaves were there now, pale and new and specific to early spring in this yard, in this parish, in a light that I have been watching my whole life. Now, it is a Tuesday, in late February. The coffee is the right temperature, which is a thing I do not take for granted. The newspaper is open on the table. The household log is beside it. The lockbox is in the second drawer of the secretary desk, where it has been for 6 years, where it will be for as long as I am here to keep it there. I have been thinking about what it means to hold a thing for 26 years, and have nobody ask about it. The patience required, the trust required. In the thing itself, in the fact that facts do not expire, in the understanding that the moment of their relevance is determined not by the holder, but by the need. I held 11 deeds for 26 years, because Armand trusted me to hold them. I held them through his illness and through his death and through the grief year and through the years after, through Thanksgiving tables and December mornings and a January chat notification. And the deeds did not change because I was managing them or because I had a plan. They changed only once, when I added explicit language and changed my executor designation, which was not a plan. It was maintenance. It was what you do when you are a person who keeps records, which is to say it is what you do always. What I have come to understand, not in this story, not from being removed and then restored, but over a long time before any of this, over the course of a life spent organizing the things that families cannot bring themselves to face, is this. There are 2 kinds of power in a family. There is the power that holds the room, the power that controls the conversation, sets the seating, decides what is a celebration and what is a problem, determines who is invited to the digital equivalent of the dinner table. That power is real. It is not nothing. It does things that matter. And there is the other kind. The other kind is in the drawer. It does not hold the room. It does not manage the conversation or decide who is light enough to keep around. It simply exists, documented and dated and notarized, holding the space that everyone in the room will eventually need. It holds that space, whether or not the room remembers it is holding it. It holds that space, whether or not anyone thought to ask where it was. It holds that space at 5:47 in the morning when the phone is quiet and the coffee has gone cold and a gray line of system text has just appeared on a screen to say that one variety of belonging has been removed. You can remove a woman from a conversation. You can decide she is too heavy for the lightness you want, too concerned with the things that last, too attached to the paper trails that prove a family is what it says it is. You can do all of that. It is permitted. It is even understandable. But the documents do not know about any of that. The documents are in the drawer. The key is on my ring. The ring is in my hand. I reached for my coffee. Still warm. I let that be enough.